वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. Today we are starting a special series, Perspectives of Women on China. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. We have the privilege to begin our discussion under Perspectives of Women on China series with an authoritative scholar who has rich and in-depth knowledge on China, Professor Madhu Bhalla. Professor Madhu Bhalla was professor in Chinese studies at the Department of East Asian Studies, Delhi University. She has an MA and Ph.D. from Queen's University, Canada. And before joining Delhi University in 2005, she taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Queen's University, Canada. She has held a visiting fellowship at the Fudan University, Shanghai, and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Sichuan at Chengdu. She has served on the Executive Council of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, from 2006 to 2010, and is currently on the advisory councils of the China centers at IIT Madras, NG University, Kottayam, and Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. She's currently also an editor of India Quarterly, published by the Indian Council of World Affairs. Very warm welcome to you, madam, in this Nation State Dialogue series, Perspectives of Women on China. Let me begin by asking you about, some cultural perspectives, and that would be the focus of today's discussion. So when we talk of India-China cultural connections, we generally talk of Buddhist linkages. So how do you see, the cultural ties between India and China? And in specific, can you please throw some light on the Buddhist connections between India and China in the past?
Okay, that's a very familiar. Thank you, Geeta, for the introduction, first of all, and for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure talking to you. But specifically on the question you asked me, when we talk about India-China cultural connections, I think a great deal is made out of almost nothing, right? And there's a genealogy to this idea that we have these vast Buddhist connections and that binds us together, and we have a common historical past. Right after we got independence, around the time that we got independence, the idea of an Asian identity became an interesting idea, and one that was critical to looking at how Asian states after colonialism would deal with each other. Right? Would they deal with each other as foes? Would they deal with each other cooperatively? What kind of institutions could be built on that sense of identity? And I think one of the things that became central to that sense of identity, because we had no prior political dialogues with China, was the idea of culture and placing culture at the heart of this notion of Asian identity. And that culture that, the form of culture that was then picked up was actually Buddhism. Nehru writes fairly early on this Buddhist connection. And of course, there were various people around at that time, including Tagore, including many Buddhist scholars in Sri Lanka, as well as in China and Japan, who were also talking about these Buddhist connections. But the form of these Buddhist connections was sort of obviated, right? And it was mostly ignored that the connections that we were talking of were connections that were made at a specific historical time and then ceased to exist, right? So we were looking at Buddhism in China. We were sort of, extracting from these historical Buddhist relationships to a modern Buddhist identity and pan-identity. So in a sense, if you look at the genealogy of the idea was formed in the sense of how Asian states would deal with each other in a post-colonial order. And while the effort was not useless, it was not, entirely without value, I should say, the effort was somewhat misled, because I think it prevented Indian scholars from actually looking at those Buddhist connections and placing them historically. So the very ahistorical dialogue that emerged from this gave rise to a vast literature in India on India-China connections, civilizational states, the fact that we would never go to war together. We had affiliations and affinities that would keep us aligned on most global, regional, and national issues. That did not happen. Right? And that didn't happen precisely because we didn't look closely at history. If you look closely at history, every time there has been a strategic overlap between China's strategic interests and ours, we have come to war. We have been in conflict. You look at the Kushans, for example. You look at the Sikhs, the Dogra kings, for example, and you will find in history quite a few examples, at least these two large examples, where we actually went to war with troops that were under the control of China, whether it was a Chinese general on the frontiers above Kashmir, or whether it was with the Dogras and the Nepalese and the Tibetans, right? So what we are looking at, I think, is the fact that we need to be more historical in our approach to even suggesting the idea that Buddhism is this very strong link between China and us. The second thing is, the Buddhism that we talk about is not the Buddhism that the Chinese have spoken about for many centuries. Because that Buddhism that went from India to China was completely Sinified, and many Taoist values and belief systems then became a part of that to make it acceptable to local populations. So the soteriology, the eschatology of Chinese Buddhism is extremely different from this eschatology and the soteriology of what was Indian Buddhism at one period. Thirdly, Indian Buddhism ceased to exist in India. Okay, a long time ago. Whatever the reason, historical reasons for this was, the rise of Brahmanism again, changes in political power in India, the lack of political patronage for Buddhist organizations, institutions, etc., right? A range of issues. While it remained, in a sense, a form of faith amongst the population, amongst the political hierarchy in this country, it ceased to exist. And it ceased to get the support that Buddhism had got in its early stages. In a sense, it never developed further in terms of a more modern soteriology or eschatology or a set of beliefs that would take in all the Brahmanical Hindu beliefs and remain a vibrant religion in India. And so in China as well. After the Tang Dynasty, it actually did cease to exist as a major driving religious force in Chinese society. So we are basically dredging history and trying to find affiliations that a long time ago drifted away, okay? And I think if we want to build a relationship on these affiliations, it's a pretty rocky basis, it's a pretty rocky background to doing that. So we really should be more historical. We don't need to actually pick up ahistorical ideas and try to base policy on that, because policy doesn't actually work like that. And if you look at the debates in Buddhism today, what we're looking at is China is making a claim to being the dominant Buddhist state and the supporter of Buddhism globally. India seems to have a competitive urge to do the same thing. So the ICCR, for example, has held many conferences on Buddhism, in various Southeast Asian, and there was one that we did in Beijing as well, right? In an effort to actually create that sense of having ownership over Buddhism, right? The ownership over Buddhism is long lost, actually, both for China as well as for us. So in a sense, I think if we want to revive these affiliations, we should do so not so much in terms of claiming ownership to Buddhism, but in terms of looking at the kinds of dialogues that took place during a period of Buddhist exchange amongst scholars, amongst traders, amongst a variety of people who were engaging in these beliefs, and see whether we can replicate those dialogues, not so much ownership of this religion, but the dialogues that actually helped this religion to grow and that created a sense of trust in society and community on the basis of this religion. I think we failed to do that in large measure, right? So seriously, so therefore, in one sense, I think the connections, the connections that Buddhism created between China and India are a good area for research, but I think from an entirely different perspective, not from the perspective of ownership, of competitive ownership, claims to power, claims to having a better civilization that was co-opted by other countries. I think these are the wrong approaches to actually take to this entire question.
So I'll come back to your point about civilization of Buddhism and also about putting that in the historical context. But let me debate a little bit in terms of the historical thing when we are talking about. We are mostly focusing about the cultural connections in terms of Buddhism. So a lot of talk is about Buddhism impacting China, but nothing is, really talked about the spread of Hinduism in China. In your view, what were the reasons and challenges in the history that really, impeded us to have Hinduism as a spread rather than just Buddhism? I mean, which is again, partly coming out of Hinduism.
I think Hinduism is a very different. Is a very different issue altogether than Buddhism. Buddhism was more easily taught to communities through disciples. Hinduism is an idea that actually creates its space through dialogue and debate and discussion. And I think that history, which is not to say that Buddhism in India did not debate and discuss and all of that, but since there was a core set of principles that could be readily told to people, right? And therefore, people could convert to the idea or at least accept these ideas and use them in their everyday life in a very clear sense. Even if a monk did not know the extreme complexities of Buddhist soteriology or eschatology, the monk still knew that there were certain principles by which he or she could live, right? And so for the lay community. In India, in Hinduism, I think the issue was much more complex because there were layers of beliefs within Hinduism which contest the notion of Hinduism as a one way of thinking, right? So it's not a book religion. It is not a religion of the text, if you will, right? And therefore, to convey Hinduism to populations to whom the ideas of Hinduism are completely alien was a much bigger task, right? We see Hinduism spreading to Southeast Asia, not so much in a messianic or a conversion mode, but with traders, which communities that went to Southeast Asia, stayed there, lived by their beliefs, created their institutions, and then it spread to the community. This did not happen for us in China, although there were communities of Hindus in China. For example, in southern China, you have Tamil communities, Tamil trader communities who lived there. But China being such a vast country, and southern China, historically being completely different from the rest of China. I mean, southern China has always been problematic for the Chinese state, for the Chinese emperor, and there have always been historically efforts to try and keep it together with China, assimilate it or control it. So, southern China is much more vibrant. Pangzhou, Fuzhou area is much more vibrant in terms of many cross-cultural communities historically having lived in those areas, and because they became the pivot of trade with Southeast Asia. So there was a coming and going, a migration, transmigration that actually allowed various different religious communities to stay there. For example, there is a mosque there, very old mosque there as well. So Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, it was just a cauldron, frankly. This is not true of the other parts of China, where, the more deeper beliefs in Taoism and Confucianism would have actually questioned very critically the many forms that Hinduism takes, the many rituals, the many forms, the many deities, the nature of multiple gods, right, that Hinduism takes. Which is not to say that Buddhism didn't do that. I mean, the notion of Kuan Yin, for example, the notion of the Bodhisattvas, for example, it did take on many of the Hindu beliefs, but by the time this went to China and stayed in China for some time, it was completely taken over by much more, sinified notions of, deities and forces to whom you could actually ask for succor. So in a sense, Buddhism is a very troubling concept. I mean, Hinduism is a very troubling, set of concepts and beliefs and rituals for societies which don't have a community where they see it being, lived by in these communities. So I think that's one of the reasons that Hinduism didn't get through. But I think another thing was, of course, that by the time the golden age of the Guptas came, and the various kingdoms emerged in India. the regionalization of India had become a fact. And when the regionalization of India became a fact, I think there was no clear trajectory that any state took in terms of expanding its soft power, what we today we call soft power or cultural influence abroad.
Yeah, so you were talking about this cultural power and the ownership of Buddhism. So let me talk to you in the sense of how culture is perceived in today's time. We see that in present day, it's looked upon as a tool to gain control over others. And when we see, China talking about Buddhism, whether it is in Nepal's Lumbini or talking about Sarnath, I mean, there is a kind of competition of ownership of Buddhism, So how do you see, China's cultural spread, particularly as we only talk of, Chinese spread of Buddhism in other Asian countries, whether it's Southeast Asia or others, whether it's Taiwan, and whether it's Japan or Indonesia or any other country. And at the same time, even today, when we talk of Confucius institutes, I mean, reestablishing their cultural notion as a strong entity about, what is the superior culture? How do you need to spread about it? So how do you see that kind of, the kind of connections that we have and evaluate that?
Historically and even today, I mean, culture has always been implicated in power, right? When we think about culture, I think very often people make the mistake of thinking culture has nothing to do with power, that culture stands by itself. You can have the arts and you can have, the visual arts or whatever arts, right? And you can have literature and all of that. And it doesn't actually lend itself to politics, and yet culture lies at the heart of politics. It is the kinds of narratives that we create, the cultural narratives that we create, the cultural narratives that we create around trust, around mistrust, around confidence, about what is ethical, or communities that are, or values that are ethical, values that are moral, values that are superior, right? These are then used by policymakers to evolve policies that can either constrain other communities, other people, other nations, or that can be liberating, okay? And they can be liberating for their own people, but constraining for other people. We have seen that with the colonialism, okay? The narratives that emerged during the 18th and 19th century, 17th, 18th, 19th century, around what was civilized, what was savage, and therefore what was superior and what was inferior, allowed the West to actually control large swaths of Asia and Africa. Okay, and to enslave, many, many people who had longer historical civilizations than the West had ever had. Okay, so what cultural narrative therefore did was to destroy their confidence in their own culture, and had them scrambling for looking for values within their own culture which they could reinstate post-colonialism. Okay, so in a sense, I think cultural narratives tied to state power are very effective in implementing policies, certain kinds of policies, actually most policies, right? We see that with the United States as well. I mean, the whole idea of the city upon the hill, American values, the American dream, was at one time focused upon their own people, their domestic, communities and their domestic audiences, okay? And it was meant to draw people to America as a land of freedom. Okay. This, of course, stopped by the 19th century. When America became extremely expansionist, the first Spanish-American War, the Philippines, etc., acquired its first colonies. And then it was directed to people outside, that these are the values that are good. So, if we come to you, that's fine. We are fighting for better values for you. Okay. So in a sense, I think all nations tried to do that. But you need to have sufficient economic power, you need to have sufficient hard power for culture as politics, as a narrative to become effective. We saw that under colonialism, the uses of new technology, shipping, navigation, all of that, technologies of control, cannons, guns, all of that, the whole military technology that emerged, the RMA that emerged out of that. So in a sense, cultural narratives lend themselves to power innately and critically. Okay, so when we talk about culture and cultural narratives, I think today we must look at cultural narratives at the heart of nationalist discourses, whether it is India, whether it is China. Okay, the idea that Modi has floated, and actually it's not just Modi, I think generally there has been a consensus around the idea that India has these certain values and beliefs that are ethically correct and morally right. Okay, and so therefore, when we engage in a war or when we engage in conflict, it is just war. Okay, we have taken that from the Western notion of conflict, that when you fight a war, especially from the American notion of conflict, when you go to fight a war, you're fighting a just war. Okay, it's not a war for oil, it's not a war for territory, it's not a war for enslaving people, it is a war to actually provide freedom. Okay, and opportunities. So this notion of just war has now become ingrained, I think, and no country across the world can do without actually perpetuating this notion of just war. Whereas, of course, we know that no war is actually just, and history will tell you that. So if you take a historical perspective on war, you begin to think, what is just? For one example is when you call somebody a terrorist, the terrorist might think he's actually a freedom fighter. Right? He's actually fighting for his own freedom. So the whole Palestinian issue, for example, is actually framed around that dialogue, around that narrative. So what we are looking at is really that culture lies at the heart of power, and cultural narratives allow that power to be implemented. They ease the implementation of that power by trying to persuade people on whom that policy is going to be implemented that this is good for you. Right? It is morally good for you, it's ethically good for you, we have come as your saviors, and we will do good for you. So China has invested a lot of money in trying to be the good guy. Right? So its Confucius centers, its cultural centers, the BRI, for example, right? The entire narrative that has emerged out of the BRI and out of, the notion of harmony, the China Dream, for example, these are all ideas that are meant to persuade people around China, globally, regionally, that China has nothing to gain from what it does. China is doing this for the good of the world, for the good of the region, for the good of its neighbors. Okay. Now that may be very well be a narrative that goes down well with the Chinese public, and I think you see that in social media in China. When somebody criticizes China, the barrage of trolling and abuse that comes your way is really indicating that criticism of China is hurtful to the Chinese people because they feel that China is a good guy, right? China is doing good. So in a sense, the Chinese population by and large has basically bought this idea of China as great power coming back to its prominent position and therefore being able to do good to the world, contributing public goods to the world. So in a sense, there is a sense, and it is tied then to nationalism, right? That as a nation, right, China has this kind of messianic almost ability and role to play, okay? The other thing, of course, is that, as I said, since culture lies at the heart of power, it also lies at the heart of what China is constructing today, which is a public ethic. Okay, this is an alternative public ethic for the world. So it says, Western values. Well, we've seen what Western values do. They're based on competitiveness. They are based on conflict. We are not based on conflict. We will never actually take territory that is not ours. We will never fight a war against people, right? We will only fight for what is our own. Okay. Now, when they define our own, obviously there are a lot of, you can raise a lot of questions about what is their own. I mean, their own is Ladakh, their own is, South China Sea Islands, their own can be parts of, Korea. So, I mean, their own is very contentiously defined in one sense globally. But nevertheless, the idea that and so this is a sort of public ethic that China is now providing. That we are not a colonial power. We will never be an imperialist power. We will never be a hegemon. Okay, the three terms that they use to critique the West since the 1950s onwards. Okay, so China has placed itself in a category by itself, where it is alone kind of the imprimatur of public ethics is something that China will now provide to the world. So these narratives are very strong, and mind you, a lot of these narratives had actually been bought by some countries because they feel that China has come as a savior, either to their economy or to development, is providing them loans which don't place strictures on their behavior or on the implementation of their policies, and don't expect them to change if China is going to be working for them. right? Which basically respects their way of functioning. Okay, now that is very attractive, obviously, to many, many countries who have been fighting an anti-colonialist imperial kind of narrative for a long time. So in a sense, these narratives have the function of persuading and creating levels of confidence and levels of and kinds of dialogues that are useful for China, and in its effort to accrue power to itself and global influence to itself, right? But mind you, this has to be linked also to a level of economic development. If China did not have the cash book, right? If China did not have the bank books to be able to support this, these would be useless banter. As for example, is our narrative on, the greatness of India, the public goods it provide, the ability of our culture to, to define the world, right? Many of these things ring hollow for India because we do not have the hard power right now to be able to sustain this dialogue and to persuade people of the functionality of this dialogue, right? So in a sense, I guess that, culture, therefore, cultural narratives, therefore, they shape public policies, they shape political agendas, they shape political initiatives, and they, at the heart of it, they are able to be successful because they persuade people, are able to persuade communities, states, other states, partners, that what they are doing is the right thing. Okay. So therefore, I think we need to look at culture as being at the heart of politics, and we need to be able to, as a society, as a community, as a polity, to be able to look critically at our own cultural narratives and see how far these cultural narratives are able to actually meet the agendas that policymakers set.
So when you're talking about the cultural connections and how the narratives are being used by the state as a power to float those narratives, we're also talking about a new dimension at which India is really refocusing on its cultural connections with many Asian powers. So what connections tell us about our foreign relations, and how do you analyze them?
Okay, let me put it differently. I think looking at how significant culture is to any set of relationships, I think it's a good initiative, I should say. Okay, I think these initiatives have been there before, but haven't taken on a very well-defined role. One of the most important, I think, a very important initiative, I think, that the Indian government announced some time ago was a MOSAM initiative, okay? And I'm sort of giving that as an example of how things can go well and how things can go wrong in these situations. The MOSAM initiative was actually meant to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative. It is actually meant to indicate that there was a region of confluence in the monsoon countries, or in the countries around the Indian Ocean region, where for centuries there had been very intensive exchanges, not just in trade and commerce, but also in ideas, also in scholars, also in the texts, which went from one place to another and were translated. For example, Baghdad had a huge, very important translation project in which it translated the Gita, it translated Indian religious texts, it translated Chinese texts, and these were then sent on to Europe. So in a sense, there were these very intense sets of exchanges that happened. And the MOSAM initiative was meant to actually revive that, in a sense, or at least to look at those and see how these exchanges could be revived at multiple levels, okay? Now, what happened with this MOSAM initiative was it became a MOSAM project, and it became a project to actually, to say to UNESCO that you should define this as a cultural heritage project, right? And it was left there. Now, the point is that if you have an initiative like the Mawsum Project, which is looking at the way in which in countries around the Indian Ocean area, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, right, interacted with each other, you need to bring these countries on board with you. This cannot be just at India's project, right? It has to be a project in which other countries around the Indian Ocean region are persuaded that it is useful for them and it is good for them to actually revive these connections once again, okay? That wasn't done. So, I mean, in something that I wrote some time back, I suggested that we should not be looking at this as India's project. This is to be a regional project where everybody has to be partnered with it and wants to actually revive these kinds of linkages. And the hard work on that would be to engage with communities of scholars, researchers, political leaders across this area and bring them on board. Now, the thing is that we have put very limited resources into something like this, right? And I think that the idea of having equitable discourses with large and small nations across this area, somehow it seems to me does not appeal to policymakers and the people who should have been engaged with this project at a official level. So what we have is a very desultory sort of attitude towards what could have been amazing initiative. Because here you can actually use culture or look at culture and how it creates and binds, creates dialogues and creates more than anything else trust, which is something that is missing, solely missing in many sets of relationships that we have with countries, okay? Because trust is a very, very difficult thing to build up and it takes many, many generations to build trust. So if you could call upon your previous generations and look at how they interacted with each other and the kind of regard and equity there was in their relationship, equitable relationships that existed, then I think it would not be a bad idea to actually push that idea across the Indian Ocean, literally. Okay, but that has not been done. And so my concern is that when we try to push culture as part of our soft power, what we are doing really is saying Indian culture is dominant. Indian culture is superior. We have a rich civilization. We have many, many strands of culture that we have given to the world in different times. And so we will go and look at those strands, right, that have gone from India to these states or to these nations or to these communities, and we will revive that and celebrate that. That may not be a very good thing, because I think we are dealing now with states where nationalism, domestic nationalism, is very much part of the political picture and political narrative. So for India to really go and say to Sri Lanka, for example, that, we gave you Buddhism and these Buddhist sites, which are related to the Buddhism that came from India, is the ones that we will celebrate in our relationship, may not go down that well with Sri Lankan communities. So therefore, because they will say, well, we changed that Buddhism, okay? We transformed that Buddhism to something that was our own. So can we please celebrate all of that as well, okay? So what I'm saying is that this tendency to be culturally hegemonic, we say we are not a politically or a militarily hegemonic power, but I think we are culturally hegemonic. And that is, I think, a deep flaw in the way in which culture is actually linked or tied to policy and tied to soft power, okay? I think soft power to be effective has to be persuasive, okay? You have to be able to persuade the recipient community that your values, your beliefs, and your behavior is something they would like to adopt, right? I do not see that happening across Southeast Asia, and I have traveled in Southeast Asia where the Indian discourse is of no consequence at all. Right? So we need to understand, we need to question this, we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we do not find a receptive audience for the kind of trajectory that we want to take in terms of our soft power policy, in terms of our public diplomacy, okay? So that's one issue. The second thing, I think, for soft power to be effective, it also needs to be linked to a hard power trajectory. What is it that we want to achieve in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in what we today call the Middle East, right? What is it that we want to achieve? Are we just sort of moving from one crisis to another, or do we actually have a framework in which we place India and our policies in the long term? Okay, so without that, it seems to me, and I think our foreign policy today is pretty truncated, it's pretty conflictual. It is a mix of many things that sometimes don't seem to be related to each other. So I think we need to be able to say, look at it very clearly and say, if cultural policy is to be effective, to be persuasive, if it is meant to build trust, then we have to link this to a very clear set of objectives in terms of our other hard power policies. And thirdly, I think for soft power to be effective, it must first create a consensus around values and beliefs at home, right? In India today, I think we are extremely conflicted. Despite the dominance of the BJP and the number of seats it has in parliament, which we are extremely conflicted about the values and the beliefs that are either being propagated or are not being propagated, right? So so domestically, I think this conflict at home does not speak very well for our wanting to put forward a set of conflicts, a set of beliefs and values abroad, right? And thirdly, I think, lastly, as I said, for soft power to be effective, it has to be equitable. It has to be equitable dialogues, right? So when we go to Southeast Asia, we go to Cambodia, Laos, we go to Vietnam, we go to Indonesia, right? We need also to be able to look at the existing culture within these countries and say, yes, you've transformed what went from India, and this is a great transformation. This is of great interest to us, right? But that sense of transformation and change of what was sent from, or what went from India, I would say, right, is lacking. So we don't have a real interest in the cultures of the nations around us. We only have an interest in the culture, supposedly, that went from India, and which in some form or in some transformed way, still exists, both in its architecture or in so small communities who believe in that, etc. Like in Bali, there is a Hindu community, all of that, right? So we need to change this attitude a little bit. I mean, if the Americans came and did that to us, I think we would be extremely mortified, right? If the Europeans have done that to us, we have been extremely mortified and extremely annoyed about this. So, we need to understand how cultural hegemony works and why we do not need to be culturally hegemonistic in the region.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to be made. I mean, when we want to be, persuasive, we have to really float the ideas at multiple levels in a different way and engage in the dialogue. I think Chinese have been doing that, civilizational dialogues and multiple layers of, dialogues with people, with government, with parties, in order to create that, which is one of the things we really need to look at. But just pointing to my last question to you and moving back to our India-China thing, and talking about the overlapping things that we are doing at the cultural level, at the Buddhist levels, or in other areas of the cultural connections. Can you give some concrete suggestions on how we should advance our ties with China, considering the tensions that we have at the border? I mean, of course, at multiple layers, but specifically in terms of the cultural connections that we have with China.
And one of the things that I often hear, and I have heard now for many years, whenever I have been to conferences on India-China relations, read stuff that my colleagues have written on that, or other people that I don't know and yet who are writing on India-China relations written, is that there is a lack of trust. The central issue between India and China is a lack of trust, right? And I think it would be very useful to look at, the notion of trust in international relations and interstate behavior, and how trust is destroyed and how trust can be built up. What builds trust? Okay. Certainly, what builds trust or what destroys trust is antagonistic behavior, right? Military conflicts in other areas, a complete, difference in values and orientations. This tends to destroy trust, right? Or at least it does not build trust. So, in a sense, when we say we need to build trust, and every dialogue with the Chinese comes down to that, right? We need to build trust. Okay, any track to dialogue, any 1.5 dialogue, all of this comes down to this. Why don't we believe each other? Okay, the Chinese don't believe us when we talk, and we don't believe the Chinese when they are saying anything. We're always looking for an underlying sort of meaning to what they are saying. Read between the lines is a very famous phrase that Indian policymakers actually use when talking to the Chinese. So in a sense, I think the notion of trust is a very significant notion, and I think we need to address that. How do we create this trust? As the Dalai Lama said once, to earn trust, money and power aren't enough. Okay, you have to show some concern for others. Okay, and you can't buy trust in the supermarket. So I'm quoting the Dalai Lama. And I think this is very, very sort of central to this. You can't just go out and buy trust. You can't put your money on something and say, I'm going to make you a red line, and now you're going to trust me. I'm going to, invest in your mines or in your ports and your harbors, and now you're going to trust me. Okay, that it doesn't work like that. And we have seen that. We have trade with China. Obviously it is lucrative to some sectors of our economy, although it may be a very skewed trade. But nevertheless, we do have that, but it has not created trust. Okay, we work together within regional organizations, BRICS, for example, the SEO, for example, all of that. We are members of the AIIB, and yet we don't trust China. The Chinese don't trust us, right? So therefore, I think the notion of trust is at the heart of this. How do you build trust? One of the problems with building trust is that if you have different polities, right, which espouse different sets of beliefs and values, and the social contract with the state-society contract is a very different kind of social contract, you are less likely to have the language with which you can dialogue with each other, right? You're less likely to assume that what we are saying is comprehensible to the Chinese, and the Chinese are saying is comprehensible to us, okay? So in one sense, I think, it's very important, therefore, to come much more closer, to understand, I think, the political values of each state very clearly, and to understand whether they are antagonistic to your interests or they are actually in sync with your interests, right? If that happens, then it's okay. I mean, there was a study that took place, I think, some time ago, which looked at about 17 countries, right? And looked at whether they had built trust or not built trust. And it came to the conclusion that it's not primordial ties, it's not historical ties, but it's actually societal learning and economic development that actually creates trust among states, right? And we see that this in the history of Europe, for example. Right, till 1945, Europe was fighting with each other. They were fighting with each other. We had 2 world wars in Europe, right? After 1945, there was a great, what shall we say, what's the term for it? In any case, there was a coming together of France and Germany, right? And that fact of coming together between France and Germany, the 2 largest powers in Europe at that time, and we are excluding the Soviet Union at that point, which is Soviet Union, right, created long-lasting peace in Europe for a very long time, till the demise of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Baltic Wars once again. Okay, so we are looking at the fact that countries need to make these large bargains, these huge bargains, right? Which may at that point seem to undercut national interest, narrowly defined, but which can in generations to come establish the kind of peace on borders between states that can be conducive to economic development and social growth. Okay? Now, these notions of grand bargains, it seems to me, are foreign to any kind of a dialogue between India and China, right? Or between warring states in Asia, because we are still at the heart of it, creating our national states. Okay, Europe was well past the idea of creating national states by the time the Second World War ended. And the idiocy of creating national states became very apparent in the Second World War. You know, the complete non-usefulness of this, right? So, but we are very much at the heart of creating national states. We are states still in the making, right? Even domestically, we have not actually created national consensus amongst all our states or amongst all our people. So we have these pockets of opposition, pockets of dissent, pockets of, you know, non-consensual behaviors. And we cannot at this point, I think, get our minds around the notion that we may have to make a grand bargain to be able to buy peace in the region. Now, what these grand bargains could be are multiple things, right? I remember at one conference, I remember this was in Australia, we were having conversation in India and China, and I mentioned that perhaps we need to have this grand bargain. And the response from the Indian side was extremely strong. So why should we have a grand bargain, right? But if you look at history, and if you look at the way in which peace has been made historically across borders, it has actually come down to making that grand bargain, to saying, all right, in the interest of peace, we will do this, right? But the fact of the matter is grand bargains can only be made if there is a level of trust, right? So at the heart of all of this, it seems to me, is that we need to create this trust. First, we need to examine how trust can be created, and then we need to actually create trust, right? So right now, it seems to me that India-China relations are going to go the way they are going. The best we can do is manage that relationship. We cannot grow that relationship in any significant fashion because we are not thinking outside the box, nor is China at this point thinking outside the box, right? China has deeply ambitious nationalistic agendas, right? It has a notion that it has to claim all of its historical territories, okay? And if you look at the Dogra War, in which Ladakh and Leh became part of the Dogra kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, you will understand why this is. Because in a sense, Ladakh and Leh were parts that were won from Tibet by the Dogra king. Dogra generals were saying, okay? So really, history will, if you look at the history of the situation, you will understand what happened. And you can also understand why China seeks to do what it does, although to reverse history is also not a very sensible thing to do, because if you started to reverse history, half of the North Indian population would be back in Central Asia, right? I mean, if you believe that they came from Central Asia. So in a sense, to reverse history seems to me a extremely unrealistic thing to do. But this is what China is doing today, and which is at the heart of the conflict that China has across its borders, whether in the Southeast, whether in the South China Sea, whether with Japan, with Korea, South Korea, whether with us, right? The only country it is not at war with, where its claim to territory and its actual presence on territory is a reality, is Pakistan, because Pakistan itself is an ahistorical creation. Right. So, in a sense, I think history has much to tell us, and I think we need to look to bring history back into our understanding of international relations and interstate relations. Right.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, to discuss all of these issues, and especially, to understand how the history is a lens to rethink about our present relations and redraw, some lessons from it. Maybe that would be very conducive for relations. Also about how we are going to rethink about our cultural connections with other countries, may it be China or may it be Southeast Asian countries. That is one of the focus that we would be looking at. So thank you very much, Professor Madhu Bhalla. We hope to continue our interactions. To our viewers, please keep watching our programs and keep learning. Namaste.
Thank you, Geeta. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.